and welcome to E's Bookshelf. So this is a podcast about my bookshelf, which includes historical fiction, realistic fiction, science fiction, fantasy, and mystery books. I'm your host, Alicia Driver. So in today's episode, I'll be discussing the book A Feigned Madness by Tonya Mitchell. This book takes place in the 1800s in New York City, and a young lady in her 20s is struggling. She's working to be a journalist, only with the amount of sexism in the world, it's not exactly easy for her. Her name is Elizabeth, and she is desperate to find a good story. She overheard two guards talking, and they were talking about someone who got in trouble for manslaughter when they killed a lunatic at a mental hospital. So, Elizabeth offers to disguise as a nurse to uncover the truth about this mental hospital, and Cockrell, that is the man that she works with and she works for, he tells her that she should disguise herself as an inmate to uncover the truth at this mental hospital, and that they will give her 10 days to collect as much information as possible. And then they promise that they don't tell her how they'll get her out, they just say that they'll get her out in 10 days. So she later learns that the people who work for the biggest newspaper company, aka Cockrell, is not a trustworthy man. So this book actually goes into Elizabeth's backstory, and her father had actually died without a will, and then her father's first wife and their children received most of what he had left behind, leaving Elizabeth and her mother with very little. So when Elizabeth pretends to be insane, she goes by the name Nellie Brown. She goes to the police station, and she tells them that she can't remember anything. They ask her a million questions, and then the answer every single time is, I don't know, or I don't remember. They go through every possibility before sending her off to the island, as they call it. They ask if she has family, friends, coworkers. The answer, I don't know. They bring her to a judge, and the judge believes that she has been drugged and she is not a proper lady, and that she should be sent to the island. So they examine her medically, and she starts to fully take on the role of being insane. She changes her story multiple times, and then she refuses the nurse's orders, and she puts up a fight. One of the doctors suspects that she is actually lying to them. But we later learn that Elizabeth and George McLean, who is the man who encouraged her to pretend to be insane, they actually have a really complex history. And we get into that late throughout the book, because it goes back and forth. So, she arrives at the island. The nurses are extremely rude and cold-hearted. The food is disgusting, and the crazy amount of abuse that happens in the first 24 hours is insane. Physical abuse, verbal, mental, and emotional. All extremely traumatizing to even imagine. They strip the patients of everything that gives them dignity, and the Institute is cold, dirty, cheap, and unfit to handle a patient's basic hygiene. Her first night there, she spends in an isolated room for unknown reasons. And she later discovers that not everyone there is insane. One lady is there because she was homeless, so she turned to a life of thievery. And this institution appears to be more of a prison than a hospital. Other patients there, they walk in groups with shackles. And the nurses don't clean, and they don't do chores, it's the patients that do it. And rumor has it that they put drugs in the water. They put morphine and chloral, enough to make the patients crazy. And then one day, a new lady arrives. She says that she ran away from her abusive husband, and she is now pregnant. And the nurses believe that she's not loyal to her husband and that she's carrying another man's baby. So they beat her and they shove her to the ground. And then when she gets up, she kicks one of the nurses in the stomach. And in this mental hospital, the rule is an eye for an eye. So the nurse punches her straight into her stomach while she's pregnant. And this is where Elizabeth draws the line. She will no longer play the part of the bystander with amnesia. She meets with the doctor and the superintendent. She tells him that it's too cold for the patients, and soon after that, he orders the nurses to provide more protection from the cold. And a picture of Elizabeth is put in the newspaper asking if anyone knows the lady who lost her memory. A bunch of families come in hoping to find someone that they lost, and then George McCain comes in, only he comes in a couple days early. He said that he was going to get her out in 10 days. It was less than that. So Elizabeth says she doesn't know him, and he says the same thing. So we learn that they are in love, but he's married. And Elizabeth, who is now known as Nellie in the asylum, she has been gaining popularity among other women. The stories of the types of punishment that are labeled as therapy is crazy. And it's gruesome. It's just, oh my goodness. And so many women even lose their menstrual cycle due to the lack of nutrition. And then the next day, a man appears. He's to come see her, saying that he is working for someone who knows her, and then she gives consent to be released with him tomorrow. So, for the first time in what felt like forever, she actually sleeps well. But that doesn't last long. She is woken up to nurses, forcing her to drink an unknown substance, and then she's brought to another section of the asylum where they do therapy. And she suddenly smells smoke. And then the building is on fire. One of the nurses is determined to see Nellie get what she deserves. But then another nurse ends up saving her life. During all this chaos, Nellie sees a woman caught on fire, and then she watches her body turn to black. And although they say, oh, everyone got out safe, Nellie knows the truth. After this, she pretty much just passes out, and then she wakes up next to her mom, and apparently she has been asleep for 2 days. She's in a hospital, a real hospital, and she's healing. She's been given food and hygiene, and it feels strange to her now. Adjusting to her old world feels weird. She begins to write, yet something is still eating at her. No matter how much she writes, she can't save the people in that hospital. And the quiet nights are driving her crazy. The asylum always had various sounds throughout the night. It was never quiet. And eventually the press spoke to the superintendent of the asylum. They published a piece that avoids all the gruesome truth. And then Elizabeth is furious. She is in court testifying the abuse that went on, and the jury is disgusted and outraged, and she could not have asked for a better outcome. An investigation of the asylum is taking place, and Elizabeth and people of high authority take a tour of the asylum. The nurses recognize Elizabeth, and now they know the truth. During the investigation, it seems as though they have altered the asylum tremendously. The food is better. The heaters are turned on. The nurses are attempting to lie about how they treated the patient. Like, this does not work because there are many witnesses. The nurses and the superintendent are taken to court, and this is an ongoing back and forth argument, and the superintendent uses so many excuses to justify the abuse that went on. This book really shows the lack of medical knowledge during this time in history, and Elizabeth goes through a lot of character development. At the beginning, her main goal was to get an article written for a paper just so she could afford to pay her rent, and now her motives have changed. Her motive now is to bring justice to all those who have suffered in the asylum. So the book ends with Elizabeth getting the job of her dreams. She continues to do social experiments to uncover the truth of the cruel world that she lives in. With that, she writes articles about issues that should be more recognized by society. Many donations were made to the asylum, and changes are being made. Everything seems to be falling into place, but Elizabeth never does get her love. McLean's wife is 5 months pregnant, and he tries to keep the connection between him and Elizabeth. She refuses. She survived so much: her father's death, her stepdad's abuse, the asylum. She would survive a heartbreak too. I was reading this book while I was at work. I'm a receptionist, by the way, and a patient asked me about this book that I was reading, and I told her about it, and she said, "Oh, that sounds sad." And I will admit, it's not a lovey-dovey book. There's not a lot of happy moments, but I do like the mystery and the drive that this woman has, and seeing things from different people's perspective. Like, the fact that a lot of the people there weren't even mentally ill, but it did make me happy reading it because those people eventually did get their justice, and word eventually gets out, and all the terrible things do come to an end. Although I do wonder if the lady who was burnt to a crisp, her name was Old Bess, I kind of wonder if she ever receives a funeral or a proper burial. Anyways, so I did research this author, and it turns out that this book is based on a true story. So Tonya Mitchell, the author, she found a story about a girl named Nellie Bly. And she wanted to read a novel about her, but it didn't exist. And Tonya was shocked at the fact that nobody had written a story about it. So she did months of research, and then she even made 2 trips. One to Nellie's hometown, and then 2, the second one to New York City. But when you search the author's name, you can find her blog. I looked at it, and I thought it was pretty interesting. I also wonder what would have happened if Elizabeth had gone undercover as a nurse, if things would have turned out differently. Like, would she have been expected to abuse the patients as well? Would she have been willing to abuse them? And if she had said no, like, would her cover have been blown? So these are just questions that came to my head. I would love to see this book turned into a movie. I think the amount of detail is amazing. And I also think that this brave woman deserves to be recognized. I had never heard of her before reading this, and I also really enjoyed the gothic feel to the story, and the cover of the book gives off like a gothic vibe as well, and it feels sort of elegant. I do want to know if Elizabeth ever figures out like what she was injected with or what she was forced to drink, or if she ever gets therapy to cope with that type of trauma. I think this is the only book that this author has written, but I would absolutely love to see her write a book about Elizabeth going undercover as an unwed pregnant woman to reveal the truth about black market babies, because that's one of the projects. Towards the end of the book, they say how like this is like a social experiment that Elizabeth wants to do. So I would love to read a book about that. Even if it's based on a true story, and even if it's not based on a true story, like going undercover as a pregnant woman, an unwed pregnant woman, to reveal the truth about black market babies, I think that'd be interesting. Anyways, if you want to ask me a question on a future episode, you can email me at aliciadriver@gmail.com. That's ELLYSIADRIVER@gmail.com. Or you can follow me on Instagram at aliciadriver. And next time I'll be back with The Woman in Red by Diana Ganavizo. Also, check out Beyond the Book with Julie on YouTube for author interviews. She was the one who recommended A Feigned Madness to me. And you can also follow her on Instagram. And next time, I'll be back with a book about romance and feminism and societal issues that also takes place in the 1800s, that takes place in South America. So until next time.